Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to Sir Harriet and fellow friends. For today's presentation, our group will be discussing several aspects of the text, beginning with the background of the short story, followed by the translation from page 5 to 14, and we will also be explaining the translation strategies used, followed by a literary analysis, and finally a conclusion and reflection on the overall translation process from each group members. So before we begin, I will now invite each group members to give a brief introduction about themselves, including the part they were responsible for translating. So let's begin with translator one.
Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. My name is Marfatin Kisana binti Ahmad and I am translator 1 and also the reviewer for this project. That's all.
Okay, thank you, translator one. So hi, me again. My name is Risa Nadia binti Ahmad Rizal, and I will be the moderator, translator two, and also the reviewer for today's group discussion on the short story Atuk by Rahmat Subada. I translated page 7 till 8 and also reviewed the translation of page 9 till 12.
Hi everyone, my name is Farzana Zaida binti Fakrul Azam. I'm also the translator and I am assigned to also review just like Risa's.
Assalamualaikum everyone. My name is Nia Anisa binti Muhammad Nazri. My role for this project is translator and also a literary analyst. And I was responsible for translating page 5 and page 10, 11 and 12.
And hi everyone. My name is Nur Aisa Khadija binti Ahmad, and I am also a translator for page 13, 14. And another role is I am the literary analyst.
Okay, thank you, translators. So, to begin our discussion, first and foremost, I'll be explaining the background of the short story itself. So, the short story Atuk by Rahmat Subada is a narrative that revolves around the memories of the narrator spending time with his grandfather, known as Atuk, in the village. The story mainly focuses on the close relationship between the narrator and Atuk, where the narrator learns many important life lessons through daily activities, conversation, and advice given by Atuk. The setting of the story takes place in a village environment where the narrator often spends his school holidays. The village is described as peaceful, calm, and free, with a strong connection to nature. The narrator frequently explores places such as the river, orchard, forest, and Atuk's house, which contribute to his meaningful childhood experiences. So Atuk is also portrayed as a loving and wise grandfather who plays an important role in the narrator's life. He is not only a family figure but also a teacher, storyteller, and cultural guide. Atto often teaches moral values through proverbs, metaphors, advice, and everyday experiences, making his teaching both meaningful and memorable. So the main themes discovered in the short story includes family bonding, intergenerational learning, wisdom and life lessons, appreciation of nature and village life, as well as cultural identity and heritage. These themes are clearly shown through the interactions between the narrator and Atto, as well as the lessons shared throughout the story. And also, the story also contains many Malay cultural elements such as proverbs, figurative expressions, and traditional values. These elements shows that how wisdom is passed down from older generations to younger ones through language and storytelling. Overall, this short story is meaningful because it highlights the important role of elders in shaping the younger generation, the value of preserving cultural traditions, and also the beauty of simple village life. It is also suitable for translation because it contains both straightforward narrative parts and culturally rich expressions that require careful interpretation to maintain both meaning and cultural context. So now with that, let us move on to the translation strategies being used in each page according to page order. So we will begin with translator 1 who worked on page 5 and also 6.
Thank you, moderator. So hello everyone, my name is Mai and I am translator 1. My task was to translate page 5 till 6 of the short story entitled Atuk from Malay into English. So while translating these pages, I have applied several translation strategies to make sure that the meaning and cultural elements of the story were preserved. So the first strategy that I used was literal translation. This strategy involved translating the text directly while maintaining its original meaning. For example, the sentence "Aku sangat merindui Atuk" was translated as "I miss Atuk very much." Since the sentence can be understood clearly in English, no major changes were needed. Next, the second strategy was communicative translation. This strategy focuses on making the translation sound natural to English readers. For instance, "Aku suka tinggal di kampung." "Aku suka tinggal di kampung." Aman was translated as "I love living in the village. It was peaceful." So instead of translating word for word, I chose expressions that are more fluent and natural in English. Moreover, I also use cultural adaptation. An example is the word luka, which refers to a traditional fishing tool. So since many English readers may not be familiar with this term, I have translated it as fish strap to help readers understand its function. And another strategy I applied was modulation. This strategy involves changing the wording slightly while still keeping the same meaning. For example, orang yang bijak dapat menjagakan apa yang bakal berlaku became a wise person can anticipate what is going to happen. So this sentence sounds more natural in English while still keeping the original message. And lastly, I use borrowing for the word temasek. I retain the original term because it is a proper noun and has cultural and historical significance. So, in conclusion, these strategies help me produce a translation that is accurate and natural for English readers to understand while still keeping the original meaning of the story. That's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Translator 1. Now, for me, I will be explaining the translation strategies being used for page 7 and also 8. The main translation strategies used were a combination of literal translation, sense for sense translation, specialization, culture retention, and also slight restructuring for natural English flow. In page 7, the major strategy used was cultural retention, where the word ato was kept in the English translation instead of being translated as grandfather or grandpa. This was done to preserve the cultural identity of the text and maintain the emotional closeness and authenticity of the relationship between the narrator and Ato. Another strategy used in page 7 was literal translation, especially for simple narrative sentences such as "I enjoy listening to Ato tell stories." These sentences were translated directly because the meaning was clear and could be naturally transferred into English without changing the structure at all. So, however, for many of the proverbs and figurative expression in page 7, sense for sense translation or adaptation was used. For example, expressions like durian runtuh were translated as windfall because a literal translation would not make sense for English readers. Similarly, the proverb about the flying bird was translated in a more descriptive way to ensure the intended meaning was clearly understood. And also, in addition, speculation was used in certain proverbs such as pisang tidak berbuah dua kali, where the translation was followed by an explanation of its meaning. This was necessary to make the implied message clear to the reader, especially that it refers to losing trust after making a mistake. And another strategy that I used was retaining imagery while clarifying meaning, such as in rambutan jantan and pokok kelapa. The original metaphors were preserved, but the translation also ensured that the moral lesson behind them was understandable in English. For page 8, the strategy used was mainly literal translation with slight restructuring. This is because text page 8 is more descriptive and does not contain many figurative expressions. The meaning could be directly translated into English while adjusting sentence flow to make it sound more natural. Overall, page 7 and 8 require different levels of translation strategies. page 7 needed more complex approaches due to its heavy use of proverbs and figurative language, while page 8 was more straightforward and mainly required clear and natural sentence structure in English. So that's all from me. I'll be passing to translator 3.
Hi, so I translated paragraph 9 to 10. And for this translation, there were several strategies applied. Firstly, I will start with literal translation. It was used for straightforward sentences to maintain the original meaning, such as Atuk memberikan peluang, were directly translated as Atuk gives the opportunity, as the structure and meaning can be clearly understood in English without modification. Secondly, adaptation was applied when cultural or contextual differences needed to be considered. Words like rezeki do not have a direct equivalent in English, so it was translated as income or livelihood to match the intended meaning in a way that is natural for English readers. Next, modulation was used to adjust sentence structure for better flow. So, for instance, membantu suami mencari nafkah was translated as helping their husbands provide for their families, which shifts their perspective slightly to preserve the original meaning while sounding more natural in English. Next, in addition, expansion was used in certain parts to make implicit meanings clearer. So, for example, tidak putus-putus was translated as never stop arriving to emphasize the continuous action more clearly for the reader. And lastly, cultural preservation was maintained by keeping key terms such as batik, as it represents an important cultural element that should not be replaced or simplified. So overall, these strategies, literal translation, adaptation, modulation, expansion, and cultural preservation work together to ensure that the translation is accurate, natural, and meaningful to the target audience. Next, please.
Okay, so now we will be moving on to my part of the translation. So I translated page 11 and page 12. So in this excerpt, the narrative shifts to a highly educational and cultural scene where Atto is explaining the history and philosophy of Malay batik motifs to a visiting group of university students. So this is how I approach translating the specific section to maintain the short story's warm and instructional tone. So first, let's look at the historical context paragraph. So the original Malay text reads, motif-motif yang dihasilkan berbentuk flora kerana agama Islam melarang lukisan haiwan atau manusia. If we translated this literally, it would read, the motifs produced took the form of flora. So to give the text a better narrative flow in English, I used modulation to change the perspective to a dynamic historical transition, translating it as the motifs shifted toward floral patterns as Islam forbids the depiction of animals or humans. Other than that, I also use transposition by converting the abstract singular noun, kehidupan, into the concrete plural, lives of ancient Malays. So this makes the sentence sound more natural to a native English reader. Now, let's take a look at the heavy use of dialogue on page 12, where Atuk lists the traditional design patterns. For example, yang itu pucuk rebung, ini naga berjuang, ini pula siku keluang. So for this entire list, my primary translation strategy was cultural borrowing. So I intentionally kept terms like tanah Melayu, pucuk rebung, naga berjuang, and lebah bergayut in their original Malay forms because this is a faithful translation method. So these are specific indigenous artistic design names. So translating pucuk rebung simply as bamboo shoot would completely strip away its unique identity as a traditional textile art element. And finally, to maintain Atuk's gentle and grandfatherly tone, I translated Tahu bunga cengkeh as the conversational direct question, do you know bunga cengkeh? Rather than a formal or rigid textbook sentence like, do you know what bunga cengkeh is? So this ensures that even in English, Atuk sounds like a warm mentor passing down ancestral wisdom to the next generation. So now I will pass this over to the next translator.
Thank you, Nia. Now I'll be begin explaining my part. So I translated page 13 and 14. And in this part of the story, the students are visiting Atuk, who is explaining the meaning behind batik motif and also teaches that every design carries a philosophy and moral values. And he also uses example from the batik motifs. So my focus was to maintain both the meaning and cultural values expressed in the original story, especially the explanation of batik motif and the philosophy behind them. So, one of the translation strategies I use is literal translation, especially when the meaning could be directly transferred without changing the structure too much. For example, the sentence, para siswa tekun pendengar penerangan Atuk was translated as the students listen attentively to Atuk's explanation. So this preserved the original meaning clearly and naturally in English. I also applied modulation, especially when adjusting expression to sound more natural in English. For example, aku seronok mendengar penerangan Atuk was translated as I enjoyed listening to Atuk's explanation. So the structure changes slightly, but the meaning and the tone remain the same. And in addition, I also use transportation to adjust grammatical structure. For example, tidak ada seorang pun anak saya yang mahu terlibat was translated as none of my children wishes to be involved. So the sentence structure shift, but the message is preserved accurately. And lastly, I use cultural preservation strategy for terms like batik and lebah bergayut to keeping them untranslated because they carry cultural significance and have no direct equivalent in English. So overall, these strategies help me maintain accuracy, clarity, and cultural meaning in the translation. That is all for me.
Thank you, translators. So now that we have completed the discussion on the translation strategies used by each group member according to the page order, I will move on to the next section of our presentation, which is the translation review. In this section, we will evaluate and reflect on the translated pages from page 5 to 14, focusing on how accurate, effective, and appropriate their translation are in conveying the meaning of the original source text. So now let us invite Farzana Zahida to give her review on page 5 to 7.
Okay, hi. So I will be reviewing translation of sections 5 to 8. So overall, the translation was very clear, fluent, and generally successful in conveying the original meaning. So the translators mainly use strategies such as adaptation, modulation, literal translation, and expansion to make the text more natural in English while preserving cultural elements. In section 5, the translation is mostly effective. The meaning is accurately transferred, especially in describing the director's memories and feelings about the village. However, there are minor issues in tone and word choice. For example, phrases like "okay, next year's school holiday" sound slightly informal and could be improved to "all right" during next year's school holidays. In addition, using "my father" and "my mother" instead of "father" and "mother" would sound more natural in narrative English. In section 6, the translation remains strong, especially in maintaining cultural references such as Tamase and the description of village life. The explanation of proverbs also shows good use of expansion. However, there are a few awkward expressions, such as set fish traps and fish with a rod. It's slightly repetitive, and the phrase about identifying fish by gender feels unnatural in English. Additionally, the translation of ulam as simply salad loses some cultural meaning. In section 7, the translator does well in conveying moral lessons through Malay proverbs, using explanation to support understanding. However, there is a slight inaccuracy in the proverb bagai burung terbang dipipiskan lada, which is translated in a way that sounds more literal than intended. The original meaning is about relying on uncertain outcomes rather than the imagery of catching a bird. Some phrases like come into a windfall are also slightly too formal or unnatural for spoken narrative English. Finally, in section 8, the translation is accurate and natural. The flow of ideas is smooth and the meaning is clearly preserved. A minor issue is the phrase entertaining guests, which would be best translated as hosting guests to match the original meaning more closely. So, in conclusion, the translation is generally effective and well structured, with a strong use of adaptation and expansion. However, a few minor issues in natural expression and proverb accuracy could be improved to enhance clarity and cultural precision. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana. Now I will be going into my part for my review on page 9 till 12. For page 9 to 12, the overall translation is generally effective in conveying the meaning of the original text, especially in terms of maintaining the main ideas and narrative flow. The translation successfully presents Atto as a respected batik expert and cultural figure, while also preserving the key information about his role in this community. However, there are several areas that can be improved in terms of clarity, fluency, and also repetition. In page 9, one noticeable issue is repetition, particularly in the sentence where the phrase about Atok's batik creation is repeated. This repetition makes the English version slightly redundant and affects the overall flow of the paragraph. A more concise structure would improve readability without changing the meaning. And despite this, the translation is still effective in preserving the intended message, especially in describing Atok's house as a center of batik activity and learning. The use of culture terms such as canting is also appropriate, as it maintains the authenticity of the source text while still being understandable due to the added explanation. In page 10, the translation is clear and meaningful, especially in highlighting Atok's role and in empowering his workers and supporting the community. The message about providing income opportunities and childcare support is successfully conveyed. However, slight improvements could be made in sentence flow to make the English version sound more natural and less directly structured for Malay syntax. So overall, page 9 to 12 demonstrates how strong understanding of meaning transfer from the source text to the target language. The translation is accurate and faithful, but with minor issues in repetition and fluency that could be refined for a more polished academic output. So that is all from me. Now I will be passing it to my Fatin to review page 13 till 14.
All right, thank you, moderator. So, hello everyone. Hello again. So, I have reviewed page 13 till 14. So, my role was to evaluate the English translation and also make sure that the meaning of the original text was accurately conveyed. So, overall, I think the translation is clear, accurate, and easy to understand. I think the translator has successfully preserved the main message of the story, especially Atup's values about cooperation, family unity, and the importance of preserving traditional batik art. And one strength of the translation is that it sounds natural in English. For example, Atup's explanation about lebah bergayut motif is presented clearly, which allow readers to understand the philosophy behind the motif and its connection to teamwork and helping one another. The translator also maintained the educational tone of the adult speech. Moreover, another strength is the preservation of cultural elements. Terms such as batik and lebar bergayut are retained, which help to maintain the cultural identity of the story while still making the meaning understandable for English readers. In terms of readability, the translation flows smoothly and also easy to follow, and the dialogue sounds natural and the ideas are also organized clearly, which allows readers to focus on the message rather than struggling to understand the language. So, however, there are a few areas that could be improved. For example, the sentence bees cling to one another that is actually symbolizing cooperation. The sentence could be revised to bees cling to one another, symbolizing cooperation for better fluency and grammar. So small adjustments like this can make the translation sound more polished. But overall, this translation has successfully communicated its original meaning, preserved important cultural values, and also provides a pleasant reading experience for the target audience. That's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, my Fatin. So now that we have completed the review of the entire translation, we have looked at how each section was translated, evaluated its accuracy, and discussed the strengths as well as areas for improvement in conveying the meaning of the original text. Overall, this process helps us better understand how translation is not only about transferring words from one language to another, but also about ensuring clarity, meaning, and cultural accuracy. So, with that, I will now be passing this presentation to Nia Anissa, who will continue with the literary analysis of the short story.
Thank you, Lisa. Um, so now we will be looking at a comprehensive literary and cultural analysis of the entire short story. So me and Alisa, as the literary analyst will both discuss the central themes, literary elements, cultural meanings and implicit values, and also how the translation shapes the meaning of the short story. So now I will look into the first central theme, which is the tension between modern globalization and cultural preservation. So the primary theme of the story explores the bittersweet reality of the modern Malay migration. While the middle generation achieves incredible global and academic success, exemplified by the father studying in Singapore and traveling to America for corporate work. So it results in a physical and cultural detachment from their ancestral village and traditions. So the weight of next is the next central theme is the weight of generational responsibility. So the story delivers a moving message that preserving heritage is a moral duty, not a financial venture. So Atok carries a hidden loneliness as the last traditional batik master, expressing deep disappointment that his successful children who became doctors and lecturers chose to walk away from inheriting his craft. So now I will be passing the last central theme to Alisa.
Thank you, Nia. So for the last central theme, I'll be explaining ecocentrism and cultural identity. So the story strongly reflects ecocentrism, where nature is seen as an important source of knowledge, values, and identity. Atuk teaches life lessons through natural elements such as rivers, orchids, forests, and plants, showing that traditional Malay wisdom is closely connected to the environment. This also highlights cultural identity, where a person's understanding of life, values, and morality is shaped through their relationship with nature. The story suggests that when this connection is lost, cultural identity becomes weakened. Next, I'll be passing it again to Nia to explain literary elements.
Okay, so now we will be discussing the specific literary elements. So I will begin with the characterization and the evolution of the setting. So the first character that is characterized is Ato. So Atto is characterized as a deeply principled, generous, and highly knowledgeable cultural guardian who seamlessly embeds lifelong values into daily activities like fishing, hunting, and painting. Next, the narrator, or can be interpreted as the grandchild, is characterized as open-minded, eager, and highly observant, acting as the crucial generational bridge who possesses a longing to absorb the heritage their parents left behind. Finally, the father is characterized as a symbol of modernization. His migration to Singapore and international career represents society's broader shift away from the traditional village life. Next, I'll be moving on to the setting and spatial evolution. So the settings expand in meaning as the story progresses. The raw wilderness of the river and jungle serves as a practical classroom for survival and character building. The outer workshop functions as a bustling communal hub of socio-economic care. Finally, the interior exhibition room morphs into a quiet, sacred cultural museum where history and philosophy are protected. Now I will pass over to Alisa to discuss the rest of the literary elements.
Thank you, Dia. For the next part of the literary elements, I'll be explaining imagery and symbolism. So the story uses rich imagery drawn from nature and village life, such as rivers, trees, forests, and batik motifs to create a vivid and realistic setting. These images are not only descriptive but also symbolic. For example, the fish symbol symbolizes a person's instinctual magnetic pulling toward their birthplace or true home. The bamboo symbol symbolizes early childhood development and the cultural belief that values must be molded when a child is still tender. And lastly, the hanging bee symbols also symbolizes the beauty of societal cooperation, unity, and selfishness. And I will also be explaining the conflict that happened in the story. So the main conflict is between tradition and modernization. Art represents the preservation of cultural heritage, especially traditional batik art and Malay values, while the younger generation move towards modern education and global careers. This creates a tension where cultural tradition risks being forgotten or left behind in the pursuit of modern success, highlighting the struggle between cultural preservation and progress. Next, I'll be passing it to Nia to explain cultural meanings and implicit values.
So, our third section examines the dense cultural meanings and implicit values that shape the actions of the characters. So, the first cultural meanings or implicit values is the spirit of gotong royong. So, Atul's entire approach to his batik enterprise is a direct critique of individualistic, profit driven capitalism. So he intentionally simplifies his batik process using paintbrushes so that local untrained housewives can easily earn a supplementary income. And he even builds a playground for their children. So he values community elevation over personal wealth, explicitly stating that if he wanted to be rich, he could have done so 40 years ago. So in this narrative world, art and community survival are completely intertwined. Um, so yeah, that's all for my part of the cultural meanings. Now, Alisa.
Thank you, Dia. So next, for cultural meanings and implicit values, I'll explain socio-religious evolution and adaptation. So the story demonstrates how Malay culture evolves while still maintaining its core identity. The narrative highlights how the Malay identity historically adapted to external changes. The shift from older animistic patterns, such as Naga Berjuang, to more stylized floral geometry, such as Bunga Cengkeh after the arrival of Islam, shows how traditional Malay artists beautifully harmonized with new spiritual boundaries. So this reflects how cultural practice adapt to religious and social influence while still preserving the artistic tradition and cultural meaning. I'll be passing to Niana.
Okay, so for finally, we're gonna be analyzing how our specific translation choices directly dictate the interpretation and reader response of an English-speaking audience. So the effect of retaining ato and cultural terms. So by choosing the strategy of cultural borrowing, retaining words like ato, kampong, and motifs names like Pucuk Rebong, we deliberately create a foreignizing effect. So this forces an English reader to step out of their comfort zone, signaling that they are entering a specific sacred cultural space and preventing the text from sounding like a generic Western story. Um, that's all from me. So I'll be passing it over to Alisa again.
Thank you, Nia. So, lastly, for how translation choices affect interpretation and reader response, for my part, I'll be explaining how the effect of translating cultural metaphors figuratively versus literally. So, um, the translation strategy retains key Malay culture terms, such as the word ato and the batik motif name instead of replacing that with direct English equivalents. This approach preserves cultural authenticity and allows readers to experience the culture context more deeply. At the same time, the meanings of metaphors are explained in English to help readers to understand the moral and philosophical message behind Malay expression without losing their original and cultural essence. So this overall allows the English reader to instantly appreciate the profound psychological and philosophical depth of traditional Malay thought, realizing that all sayings carry heavy moral weight. So overall, these elements show that the story is not only about batik or village life, but also about culture preservation, identity, and the relationship between tradition and modern life. That is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nia and Alisa, for the literary analysis. Now, to conclude our group discussion, we will now move on to the reflection section. In this part, each group members will briefly share their thoughts on what they learned from this translation project. So let's start with translator one.
Thank you, moderator. So, my name is Mai. So, for this project, I learned that a good translation should make readers feel the same message and emotions as the original text. While working on this short story, I realized that even simple words can be challenging to translate because different languages express ideas in different ways. But in this story, there were many values related to family, community, knowledge, and traditional batik art. As translators and reviewers, we had to make sure these values could still be understood by English readers without losing their original meaning. So working in a group also taught me the importance of discussion and teamwork. Sometimes we had different opinions about the best translation, but through reviewing and giving feedback, we were able to improve our work. So overall, this project helped me become more careful with language and make me realize how important it is to consider both meaning and culture when translating a text. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, translator one. So now I'll be move on to my part. So for me as the second translator through this translation project, I have learned that translation is a complex process that involves more than just converting words from one language to another. It requires careful consideration of meaning, culture context, and also the intention behind the original text. Moreover, I also learned that different strategies such as literal translation, adaptation, and explicitization are necessary depending on the type of expression used in the text. Some parts can be translated directly, while others require deeper interpretation to ensure the message is clearly understood by the target audience. And in addition to that, this project has helped me appreciate the richness of the Malay language, especially in the use of proverbs and figurative expressions that carry deep cultural meanings. And finally, I would like to say that this experience has improved my understanding of both translation and teamwork, as each member contributed different perspectives that made the overall work more complete and meaningful. So thank you. Now I'll be passing it to translator 3.
So, from this translation class, I have learned that translating a literary text is not simply about changing words from written English or English to Malay, but it's also about carrying meaning, culture, and tone across languages. I learned that cultural context plays a very important role, especially when dealing with Malay proverbs, traditional practices, and rural settings. Some words and expressions cannot be translated directly, so decisions must be made to either explain or adapt them so that English readers can still understand the intended meaning. Overall, this task has improved my understanding of translation as a balance between accuracy, readability, and cultural sensitivity. That's all for me.
Okay, so to conclude, I think my journey through Ato, I see that there is an inseparable bond between literary analysis and translation practice. So, as analysts, we had to first deconstruct the text to understand what it's actually about. We had to identify how the theme of cultural preservation is anchored in ecocentric imagery, traditional peribahasa, and the quiet internal conflict of an aging artisan facing modernization. So, but even then, our job did not end there. As translators, we had to actively reconstruct back what we deconstructed into a completely foreign language, in this case, English. So I realized that translation is not a mechanical process of swapping words, especially in short stories that includes cultural words and cultural meanings, where we can't just simply literally translate it. So it is also an act of like finding out whether this needs to be changed or this needs to be retained. So, if we had approached this text without a literary framework, we wouldn't understand what the short story is actually about, and the tone would sound soulless. So, I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nia. And for my part, as a both translator and literary analyst, I realized that translation involved not only linguistic accuracy but also cultural understanding and literary interpretation. I had to consider how the culture context, narrative voice, and literary elements contributed to the meaning and impact of the story. Um, One of the challenges I faced was maintaining the original tone and cultural authentic- authenticity while ensuring that the translation remained natural and accessible to English readers. I also had to think carefully about how to convey meanings that are deeply rooted in Malay culture without losing their significance. And working in a group further enriched this experience as each member had their own roles and responsibilities. Through collaboration, discussion, and feedback, we were able to combine our different perspectives to strengthen both the translation and literary analysis. Overall, this experience deepened my appreciation for the close relationship between translation and literary analysis. It taught me that effective translation requires sensitivity to language, culture, storytelling, and teamwork in order to preserve the essence of the original work. That is all from me.
Thank you, Translator 5. So that is the end of our group discussion on the short story Atuk by Rahmat Subada. Thank you to our lecturer, Sir Harriet, and everyone for listening. And with that, we conclude our presentation. Thank you and Assalamualaikum.